I stayed quiet for so long that I forgot who I really was. That is not a dramatic sentence when you first hear it. It does not sound like a scandal. It does not sound like a breakdown. It sounds almost gentle. But I can tell you now, there is a deep kind of tragedy hidden inside a woman who has been quiet for too long. Because silence does not only hide your words. Over time, it hides your instincts, your anger, your preferences, your boundaries, your desires, your truth. It hides the shape of your real self until one day you are no longer sure where accommodation ends and you begin. I did not become silent all at once. No one wakes up one morning and decides to disappear inside her own life. It happens gradually, quietly, respectably. You learn when speaking honestly creates tension, and when staying quiet keeps peace. You learn when your needs are inconvenient, when your disappointment makes people uncomfortable, when your honesty is treated like overreaction, when your hurt is called sensitivity, when your boundaries are interpreted as selfishness. And if you are gentle by nature, if you are emotionally perceptive, if you want harmony more than conflict, you begin adapting. You begin editing yourself before anyone has to reject the full version of you. You begin making yourself easier to live with. At first, that feels mature, wise even. You think you are keeping the family together, keeping things calm, being the bigger person, not making everything harder than it already is. You tell yourself that not every feeling needs to be spoken, that not every battle is worth fighting, that maybe you are expecting too much, that maybe this is just adulthood, that maybe love means letting some things go. And some of that is true. Not every thought deserves a speech. Not every irritation deserves a confrontation. But there is a line, and I crossed it years before I realized it. There is a line between choosing peace and abandoning yourself to preserve it. That is what I did. I abandoned myself in small, socially acceptable pieces. I swallowed words because the timing never felt right. I smiled through disappointment because I did not want to make things heavy. I accepted explanations that did not satisfy me because pushing further felt exhausting. I told myself I was fine because I did not know how to explain the slow erosion of a self. I let too many things pass that should have been named, not because I lacked intelligence, not because I was weak, because I had become loyal to silence in a way that looked like grace from the outside and felt like emptiness on the inside. I think a lot of women know this kind of silence. It is not always silence in the literal sense. You can still talk, still laugh, still manage a house, a job, children, friendships, responsibilities. You can still appear expressive and capable, but there can be a deeper silence underneath all of that, a silence around the things that most define you, the real sadness, the real anger, the real loneliness, the real wants, the real boundaries, the real grief over what your life has become. A woman can be talking all day and still be profoundly silent where it matters most. That was my life for a long time. I became very good at functioning. I could carry conversations, smooth things over, respond kindly, handle responsibilities, be warm, helpful, emotionally intelligent. I could even appear strong, but there were deeper truths I stopped saying because somewhere along the way I came to believe they had no place to land. Or if they did land, the cost of speaking them would be too high. So instead, I became skilled at self-containment. I learned how to take my sadness inward, how to quiet my anger before anyone had to deal with it, how to make disappointment look like composure, how to keep the room comfortable at the expense of my own honesty. And the truth is, people often reward women for that. They call you patient, easygoing, strong, understanding. They say you never cause drama. They admire how much you can carry without exploding. They trust you because you are predictable, manageable, stable. But no one asks what it costs to be so easy to be around. No one asks how much of your truth you are swallowing to stay lovable. No one asks whether your calm is peace or suppression. They just enjoy the version of you that asks for less. That is one of the most dangerous things about long silence. It becomes useful to other people. It keeps life smooth for them. It keeps them comfortable. It protects them from the consequences of your unspoken truth. And because your silence is so convenient, very few people challenge it. In fact, many people grow attached to it. They do not necessarily want to harm you. They may even love you, but they are loving a version of you that has become easier to live with by becoming less fully herself. I remember times when I wanted to say something simple and could feel my whole body resist it, not because the words were difficult in themselves, because I had trained myself for so long to avoid disruption that honesty felt unnatural. I would rehearse a conversation in my head, feel it rising in me, and then soften it before it ever reached my mouth. I would replace directness with politeness, truth with implication, need with hinting, pain with a smile, and then later, alone, I would feel the familiar ache of having failed myself again. That is what silence does over time. It trains you to distrust your own voice. It makes you second-guess what you know. It asks, are you sure it's that bad? Are you sure you're being fair? Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe you should just let it go. Maybe this is normal. Maybe you are the difficult one. If you hear those questions long enough, especially inside relationships where your full truth is not easily welcomed, you begin to detach from your own clarity. You no longer know whether your sadness is signal or weakness, whether your anger is wisdom or immaturity, whether your longing is legitimate or selfish. That confusion is devastating, because once a woman loses trust in her own internal signals, almost anyone can define reality for her. There was a period in my life when I realized I was more comfortable making everyone else understandable than admitting what I myself felt. If someone disappointed me, I would explain them to myself. They are stressed. They didn't mean it. They had a hard childhood. They don't know how to communicate. They are doing their best. Maybe all of that was true, but I used compassion as a way to avoid confrontation. I used empathy as a way to stay silent. I became more committed to understanding why others hurt me than to honoring the fact that I was hurt. That sounds noble until you live in it for years. Then it becomes a trap. Because the woman who is always explaining away the behavior around her is rarely being fully seen herself. She becomes an interpreter of other people's pain instead of a protector of her own dignity. She becomes generous in ways that slowly become dangerous. Not because compassion is bad, because compassion without boundaries can become self-erasure wearing a halo. I think about how many times I said, "It's okay," when it wasn't okay. How many times I let something pass because I did not want to be seen as difficult. How many times I told myself this isn't worth bringing up while feeling something small crack inside me. People think big betrayals destroy identity. Sometimes they do. But identity is also worn down through hundreds of moments when you teach yourself that your truth is too inconvenient to deserve air. And once you do that for long enough, something frightening happens. You stop only withholding from others. You begin withholding from yourself. You stop fully admitting what you want because wanting something you are unlikely to claim becomes painful. You stop naming certain hurts because if you truly named them, you might have to change your life. You stop asking what would make you feel alive because you have become so accustomed to adaptation that aliveness itself starts to feel impractical. That is where I was for a long time. I was not only silent with the people around me, I was becoming silent inside myself. There is a loneliness in that which is hard to describe. You can be in a marriage, in a family, in a room full of people who know your routines, your role, your responsibilities, and still feel deeply unseen because the self they are in relationship with is not your full self. It is the managed self, the softened self, the edited self, the low-maintenance self. And maybe they do not even realize the difference because you have made it so easy for them not to. That hurts to admit, because part of me wanted someone to notice, wanted someone to see through the composure and say, "You are disappearing. You don't sound like yourself. What do you actually want? What are you no longer saying?" But another part of me worked very hard to make sure no one had to ask those questions. I kept life moving. I kept relationships functional. I kept the emotional weather stable. I kept proving I could handle it. That is the cruelty of self-silencing. You long to be found while also becoming harder to find. The older I got, the more I started feeling a strange grief I could not initially explain. It was not grief over one event. It was grief over dilution, over the loss of sharpness, color, and truth in my own life. I would have moments where I looked at myself almost from the outside and thought, where did she go? Not in a theatrical way, in a quieter, more devastating way. Where is the woman who used to know what she felt more quickly? Where is the woman who had preferences without apologizing for them? Where is the woman who did not need so much reassurance before speaking honestly? Where is the woman who was not always calculating whether the truth would be too disruptive to say? I do not think women talk enough about this kind of loss because it is hard to make visible. If someone leaves you, people understand grief. If something collapses, people understand pain. But what language do you use when what has been lost is your own unedited self? When the theft happened through your own adaptation? When there is no villain simple enough to point at, only years of being too agreeable in the wrong places, too quiet when it mattered, too willing to keep peace with others by making war on yourself? That was the hardest part for me, realizing that no one had forced this exact version of silence on me. Yes, there were dynamics, expectations, personalities, environments where my truth was not welcomed well, but I also participated. I chose comfort over confrontation, predictability over honesty, likability over clarity. I taught people what they could expect from me, and one of the saddest things I taught them was that they could live with me without fully meeting me. There came a point when that became unbearable, not in a loud, dramatic way, more like a private reckoning. I started noticing how often I felt resentment where I used to feel only tiredness. That frightened me because resentment is often the smoke from a fire that has been burning underneath your silence for years. I would feel irritated by things that once seemed manageable. I would feel anger rise unexpectedly. I would feel sadness arrive in quiet moments with more force than before. And I realized those emotions were not the problem. They were evidence that something in me had been trying to speak for a very long time. I wish I could say that from that moment on, I changed immediately. I didn't. Learning to speak after years of silence is not simple. It feels unnatural, dangerous, clumsy. You do not suddenly become fluent in truth just because you are finally exhausted enough to need it. You have to rebuild trust with your own voice. You have to learn that saying what is real does not automatically make you cruel. You have to stop interpreting every boundary as aggression. You have to tolerate the discomfort of being seen differently by people who are very comfortable with your silence. That may be the hardest part of all. When a woman starts speaking after years of being quiet, the people around her do not always call it healing. Sometimes they call it change, attitude, selfishness, overreaction, instability. Why? Because your silence was serving something for them. Even good people can become attached to the version of you that required less adjustment from them. So when you start telling the truth, you are not only reclaiming yourself, you are disrupting a system. And disruption, even necessary disruption, rarely feels smooth. But I can tell you this now with complete honesty. The discomfort of learning to speak was still far healthier than the comfort of continued disappearance. There is pain in telling the truth. There is also pain in living without it. The second kind just lasts longer and leaves you less intact. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell her this: peace that costs your voice is too expensive. I would tell her that being kind does not mean being silent, that emotional maturity does not mean endless self-editing, that understanding other people does not require betraying your own clarity. I would tell her that her anger is not always a flaw. Sometimes it is a boundary arriving late because she ignored it too long. I would tell her that her sadness is not weakness. Sometimes it is the ache of a self that has been living unheard. I would tell her that if she keeps swallowing the truth, one day she will wake up inside a life that still functions, but no longer feels like hers. I would tell her to speak sooner, not louder, sooner, to say, "That hurt me," before the hurt hardens into resentment, to say, "That doesn't work for me," before accommodation becomes identity, to say, "I need more," before she convinces herself that needing less is strength. To say, "This is not who I am," before years pass and she can no longer clearly remember who that is, because that is the deepest pain of long silence. It does not only cost you what you could have said, it costs you intimacy with yourself. It makes your own inner world unfamiliar. And once that happens, even freedom can feel disorienting because you no longer know what your uncensored self sounds like. I stayed quiet for so long that I forgot who I really was. But the truth is, she was not gone. She was buried, beneath politeness, beneath fear of disruption, beneath years of adaptation, beneath the role of being easy, safe, thoughtful, manageable, good. And maybe that is the part I want you to hear most if this story feels familiar to you. The self you have not heard from in years may still be there, but she will not come back through more silence. She will come back through truth, awkward truth, incomplete truth, costly truth, but truth. So if you are listening now and something in you has been quiet for too long, ask yourself gently but honestly, what have I not allowed myself to say, and who have I become because of it? Then ask the harder question, how many more years am I willing to lose before my own voice becomes a place I can live again? Do not wait too long to answer.